a friend. I said, she has a Kindle, which I do not have, and I said, I can't find letters never sent. She said, oh, I'll try to get it. Well, then yesterday at church, she said, oh, you can't wait to read it. It's so good. So with that, I will introduce you to Sandra Moran.
Thank you so much for coming. I see so many wonderful faces and familiar faces, and I'm a little overwhelmed by the people that showed up to support me, so thank you so very, very much. I cannot stress the power and magic that comes with the written word. And the fact that you're here today supporting all of Kansas's homegrown authors is absolutely tremendous. For those of you who don't know me, which I think there may be two, my name is Sandra Moran, and I am the author of Letters Never Sent. And today, in addition to reading from the novel, I will be discussing how gender roles of women in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s have changed, and how those real-world changes have shaped and informed the female characters in my novel, Letters Never Sent. Now, as you know, I am a professor of anthropology in Kansas City, and one of the aspects of my classes that I find most interesting is looking at cultural paradigms as they relate to gender roles and gender expectations. And it is in fact an underlying theme in my novel, in that the characters of Kate, Annie, and Claire struggle against the prescribed gender roles of the 1930s. And then later, in 1997, you have Joan, who is Kate's daughter, struggling equally hard with the societal expectations of 1997. Now, I know some of you have already read the novel, and I appreciate that. But for those who haven't, let me tell you just a little bit about the background of the story. Letters Never Sent is a story of three women: Catherine, also known as Kate, Annie, and Joan. And the story opens in 1997 when Joan, who is Catherine's estranged daughter, travels to Lawrence, Kansas, to clean out her recently deceased mother's home and to prepare it for sale. Now for Joan, it's a very challenging trip. And it's challenging on several levels because her relationship with her mother has been always fractious. And she dreads going home and being where she felt so inferior. And she also has some decisions to make. Now, you don't know this right off, but you come to find out that she's in a loveless marriage, that she's been having an affair with her boss, and that she's pregnant with his child. And as she's cleaning, she finds an old suitcase that contains a wooden box full of trinkets. And those trinkets include a bullet casing and a packet of sealed love letters, which she reads. Of course she does. And it's through these unsent letters that she discovers a woman who was completely different from the cold and uncompromising mother who raised her. A woman who struggled to conform to society's expectations and who loved deeply and lost that love to circumstances both within and beyond her control. She also comes to realize that despite the fact that her mother was functioning within the paradigms of the 1930s, which I'll talk about here in just a moment, Joan was working in the 1990s, and in a lot of ways their lives are very parallel. Now we see it in the description of her first morning in her mother's home, and this will be the first reading from the book. Joan stood barefoot in the doorway to the living room and stared again at her mother's rocking chair. Sleep had been elusive, and when she had dozed, her dreams had been surreal and only partially formed. She was surprised to find that she actually missed having Luke next to her, even though his snoring generally annoyed her. Luke. Despite the reason for the trip, there was a part of her that had always been looking forward to this time apart. She needed time to think, time to figure out what she was going to do about her marriage, or more to the point, her lack of marriage. Joan shook her head at the thought. There was nothing wrong with Luke, at least nothing substantial. She just didn't love him. She probably never loved him, she had come to realize. Theirs had been a romance of convenience. They had simply fallen into the relationship and then been too lazy to do anything but marry. And honestly, it seemed like the thing to do at the time. She'd secured a good job. She had a nice apartment. It had been time to add a husband to the list of accomplishments. And then children, though in retrospect she found her wondering why exactly she thought she needed them, were added to the mix. The answer was obvious, though she didn't like admitting it. She'd done it, in large part, to show her mother that she was her own woman. Guess the joke was on me, Joan muttered as she leaned against the doorframe. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. She hadn't wanted to be like her mother, but there was a part of her that knew that she was. It was clear in her action, no matter how much she tried to deny it. Like her mother, Joan had married a man she didn't love. And like her mother, she'd had children that made her feel tethered to a life that felt like someone else's. She thought about the woman she had planned to be, as opposed to the woman she had settled for becoming. She was supposed to be a lawyer rather than a paralegal. She was supposed to be living in New York surrounded by eclectic and clever people instead of living in Chicago and shuttling the kids to their never-ending social events. She was supposed to have had torrid love affairs instead of going to bed each night beside a snoring husband. Was this how her mother had felt? Was that why she had always been so distant and angry? Had she, like Joan, wished that she had made different decisions? Had she too settled? Her mother had never said specifically that she didn't love Clyde, but she really didn't have to. It was obvious. And with that description, I guess that begs the question of how could Joan feel that way? How could this be? I mean, we're talking about 40 to 50 years of advancement, a period of time that saw the women's liberation movement, bra burning, Gloria Steinem. Surely all of that must have exacted change. And it did, but not as much as you might think. Even today, 50 years after President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act in an effort to abolish wage discrimination based on gender, women are still paid 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. And this is particularly evident for women in their childbearing years. Now I say this, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Before we talk about Joan in 1997, or even women today in 2013, I'd like to provide a little bit of background regarding the social change just prior to and during the time periods depicted in the novel. Now before I begin, there is absolutely no way that I could do justice to this topic in 40 minutes. And so I want to be clear about the fact that this is a very, very general description. I'm glossing over, I'm giving you the sexy stuff, is what I'm doing. Now, it's tempting to think of societal change regarding women as this really slow progression. But in fact, that isn't the case at all. It's actually quite the opposite. You see this wave of vacillations between less and more permissive eras. And think of it kind of like an engine, or a pump, whereas when it's more permissive, you don't have as much water coming out. But when it's less permissive, or actually when it's less permissive, you don't see as much water coming out, but when it's more, you do see a lot of change. Up until the end of the 19th century, the accepted cultural norms were that women belonged in the home, where their responsibilities were what we consider traditional: cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, and of course, providing a welcoming home for her husband. But in 1890, something changed, and that was the Progressive Era. And we see this particularly in the larger cities. Now, the Progressive Era is a 40-year span that was characterized by social activism and political reform in the United States. Now, I want to be clear about the fact that the Progressive Era was not about women's rights, at least not entirely. It was much more so about social reform, of exposing corruption and getting rid of the inefficiency, waste, and injustices of the Gilded Age. During this period of time, modernization and a better, more temperate society were the goals. And you see this reform in a number of areas. Probably the most famous is prohibition. You also see it with the women's suffrage movement. Now, both of these issues were key in exacting societal change because they allowed women for the first time to step onto the public stage and to actually have a voice. First for the issues and then eventually for themselves. And by banding together through their activism, women were able to carve out previously unavailable freedoms, including, in 1920, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. So we start out less permissive, and then by the 1920s, we see a society that has become much more permissive. And the 1920s, I need to be clear, were pivotal for women. Married white women began to get more education, and subsequently they were encouraged to have both jobs and family. And the interesting thing is, this isn't just evident in the demographics. You also see it in articles in women's magazines, where they promote the idea that a fulfilling life required marriage, children, and work outside of the home. Single white women suddenly were able to live on their own and get jobs. The other thing that they were able to do that they previously weren't was to date around. Now, of course, the most extreme of these single women were the flappers. And when you think of flappers, these were bold young women who challenged old ways of thinking and behaving and demanded the same liberties and freedoms as men. Now, it should come as no surprise that where you have these new paradigms, you have new perspectives on sexual freedom. And because single women were becoming more self-reliant, and because they no longer needed to marry for financial security, they were able to make their own money, which left open the door for them to have relationships with men that were not based on getting married and being taken care of, but were in fact much more casual. And I use that term loosely. No, not loosely. And this is where I return to the characters in Letters Never Sent. The changes I'm talking about were much more pronounced and arguably accepted in larger cities. As we all know, in places like Big Springs, Kansas, which is where Kate is from, change happened much more slowly. There, girls like Kate, who wanted something more, were in fact in the minority, and they faced a lot of confusion and condemnation from friends and family. For Kate, the expectation was that she would get married, she would start a family of her own. She would stay in Big Springs, and she would live the life that her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother had lived before her. It was what was expected, but it wasn't what she wanted. Kate was of this new generation of girls who wanted a job, who wanted to see the world, who wanted to be independent. But her outspokenness often put her at odds with her mother, her friends, and chiefly her boyfriend, who was not happy with this turn of events. And her struggle, both internal and external, I believe mimics on a smaller scale the growing pains of the society at large. And you see this illustrated in the scene which immediately follows Kate's sister's wedding, where Kate is standing with her friend Evelyn and the boy that she is dating, Albert. Now, Albert is the son of the town's richest resident, and he has his eyes set on Kate. Kate and Evelyn stood in the shade of one of the towering oaks that bordered on the edge of the church property. Albert gestured to his father's car. "Want to go for a ride?" "I can't." Kate glanced over at Jeannie, who was basking in all of the attention, maid of honor and all that. "I have to stay." Albert grinned good-naturedly. "Well, how about I come over after?" Kate ignored Evelyn, who looked down at her shoes and smiled. It was common knowledge that Albert was in love with Kate and that his attempts at courtship were not going as smoothly as he would have liked. "I can't," Kate said. "I have to help Jeannie pack." Albert's grin faded slightly. "Well, what about one night this week? We could go for a walk, or we could go to Lawrence." When Kate didn't answer, Albert sighed and leaned forward. "Katie, why are you doing this?" "You know why," Kate said. Albert frowned but said nothing. She had explained to him many times that she wasn't playing hard to get. She simply didn't want to give him the wrong impression. He wanted to propose. She wanted to leave Big Springs and move to a large city as soon as she was 18. Those plans didn't include a husband. Evelyn had once asked her why she seemed so uninterested in Albert. "He's nice and funny and handsome, and he's rich." "Well, his daddy is." "He is," Kate agreed. "He's all of those things. And if I were interested in settling down and staying in Big Springs all my life, I'd probably pay him more mind. But Evie, that's not what I want." Albert or Big Springs? Evelyn had a soft, open face that made her thoughts and emotions entirely readable. Her expression showed that she was genuinely puzzled by Kate's words. "Neither," Kate said. Evelyn wrinkled her brow. "Is that bad? To want more of this?" Kate swept her hand out to indicate the area around them. "I want to see more. I want to do things." "But how would you get by without a husband?" Evelyn asked. "What would you do?" "I'd get a job," Kate said simply. Evelyn looked stricken. "Where would you live?" Well, I'd take a room with a family, I suppose, Kate said, or a boarding house. But why? Evelyn leaned forward and touched Kate's arm. Why would you want to live in someone else's house when you could marry Albert and have a family of your own? I'm sure Albert would take you to the city if you asked him. Her eyes grew bright with excitement, maybe on your honeymoon. You two could go to Kansas City or Chicago. Evie, I don't want to just visit, Kate said. I want to live there. I want to walk down the streets. I want to see people. Evelyn shook her head slowly. I don't know why. She paused thoughtfully. But you better be careful, or Albert will find someone else. As Kate lay in bed that night, she wondered what was wrong with her, that she wanted nothing to do with marriage or children. She thought about Evelyn's reaction. She'd been perplexed. And why would someone like Kate, someone who had the option of getting married to a man like Albert, want to go off by herself to a large city and work a job? It was a good question, and one that Kate had asked herself more than once with always the same answer. She simply wanted to have a life different than the one she was expected to live. With a frustrated sigh, Kate rolled onto her side and stared at the shadows the trees cast on her wall. She'd never been like the rest of her friends and family. They wanted the safety of their uncomplicated lives, and she wanted, what? Travel? Adventure? It's not healthy, her mother often said. This obsession with books and far-off places, it just makes you want what you can't have. You need to be out with your friends, not filling your head with places you're never going to see. You're 17. You're going to be graduated soon. You need to be thinking about settling down with Albert and giving me some grandbabies, not running off to Egypt or Paris or wherever it is you think you need to go. Mama, please, Kate had said in exasperation, I don't want to get married straight off. You know that. A woman can't wait too long, Katie, her mother gave her the once-over. You're young now and pretty enough, but that'll fade. You wait too long and all the good ones will be taken. Now, the thing about that conversation and that interaction is that Kate's experience really wasn't all that different from other girls from small towns who were fighting against the same familial and long-held social expectations. But all around the U.S. during this time, more and more girls were shaking off those expectations. They were going to big cities, they were getting jobs, and they were becoming teachers and nurses and secretaries and shop girls. Now, granted, these were jobs that they were limited to, but it was an opportunity for them to have independence and freedom. So fast forward 4 years to 1933, Kate has left Big Springs and now lives in Chicago, where, much to the consternation of her friends and family, she works at the glove counter at the Sears and Roebuck department store. And she lives in a boarding house with her coworker Claire and has become friends with Annie, an outspoken feminist. Now, as I said before, this is a pivotal time in American history. The stock market crash of 1929 was a not too distant memory. The Great Depression was in full swing, and just recently, Prohibition had been repealed by a constitutional amendment. The social climate during this period of time was very, very austere. People didn't have much, and most people were struggling to make ends meet. And interestingly enough, throughout all of this, there was a significant onus that was placed on women to have the responsibility to keep the family together. In fact, even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt got into the act. She wrote a book in 1933 called It's Up to the Women. And in this book, she appealed to women to keep their families strong and to do whatever it took to guide America through this economic crisis. Now, I can't stress enough that the impact of the Great Depression changed the playing field for women. The freedoms of the 1920s returned to more traditional gender roles. And we see this mindset reinforced not only in Eleanor Roosevelt's book, but also in the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. Now, the theme of the 33 World's Fair was the Century of Progress, and it was designed to show this promising future for the nation through the advancement of science and technology, and the application of those advancements in the lives of everyday people. But interestingly enough, this didn't appear to include women. Despite everything accomplished by women during the Progressive Era, the Century of Progress had very little to do with social justice, equality, or gender-related accomplishments. In fact, women were largely ignored, which was markedly different from the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, which you may If anyone has read Devil in the White City, that's the fair that was also held in Chicago. During the 1893 World's Fair, federal legislation had mandated the inclusion of women's exhibits. In 1933, there were no such mandates in place, and as a result, women found little representation in the quote-unquote century of progress. There was no women's building, and very few exhibits depicted the contribution of women. I mention this in part because the novel's set in Chicago, and it's set in 1933, and the main characters do go to the Chicago World's Fair. But I also mention it because I think that in a lot of ways, the Century of Progress Fair is a metaphor that frames the entire novel, in that it illustrates the persistent and enduring societal expectations and gender roles that are placed on women. Now, although that may have been the social climate, not all women accepted the status quo, and many found ways to get around the social conventions. And in Letters Never Sent, I try to create characters in Kate, Annie, and Claire who challenge these societal conventions by drinking and smoking and having premarital sex. The interesting thing about each of the characters is that they struggled with these conventions differently. Annie, the feminist, faced these taboos head-on, and she lived audaciously and very, very loudly. Claire pretended not to want a husband and a family, but then actively pursued that ideal. And Kate struggled to maintain a balance between the expectations of family and society with her desires for independence and sexual freedom. And this is perhaps best illustrated in a conversation between Kate and Annie in, of all places, the employee break room at the Sears and Roebuck department store. Now Annie, who has been disowned from her family because of her outspokenness and lifestyle choices, is going home to Big Springs with Kate for Christmas. And as they eat lunch, Kate asks Annie to do something that Annie does not like, and that is be discreet, and to not talk about all of the things that they do in Chicago. The other thing, Kate said in a rush, and I know I don't have to say this, but I feel like I should anyway. Please don't tell them about some of the things we do here. They don't understand my life, and they wouldn't like knowing that I drink or dance or see boys or whirl, you know, any of the things we do, really. They wouldn't approve. Ah, Kate said knowingly and grinned. Don't say it like that, Kate said, her face warm. It's not like we're doing anything wrong. They're just small-town provincial people, kind, but, you know, a little narrow in their thinking. Annie frowned. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. You know how I am. It'll be fine, Kate said. Just follow my lead. Has Claire met your family? Annie took another bite of her sandwich. No, Kate said, though not for any reason other than she hasn't had the opportunity. I'd like you to get to know Claire better, though. I think you'd like her a lot. Yeah, but would she like me? Annie asked. I don't think she really approves of our friendship. Really? Kate frowned. Why do you say that? It's just the way she looks at me, Annie said. Kate shook her head, even though she had noticed the same thing. Oh, I don't think that's it. She's never said anything like that to me. Annie shrugged. Or maybe she's just jealous. You've been spending an awful lot of time with me lately, and wasn't that time that you used to spend with her? Well, yes, Kate admitted, but not really that much. Not since she's been going around with Lenny. Oh, Lenny, Annie repeated. And what do you think of him? Kate hesitated. He's, a lot of fun. He laughs a lot. Not necessarily a ringing endorsement, is it? Annie asked. Well, he just drinks too much, Kate said, and when Claire's with him, she does too. She's just a different person when he's around. Are they sleeping together, Annie asked. Annie, Kate exclaimed, that's none of our business. So they are, Annie shrugged. I'm not surprised. So what if they are, Kate said. Oh, believe me, I don't have any problem with it, Annie said. If that's what you're into, it's fine by me. Don't judge, lest ye be judged. Judge not, that ye be not judged, Kate corrected. Matthew 7:1. Annie raised her eyebrows. A student of the Bible, so you're a Christian. You can't not be a Christian where I'm from, Kate said. Though I'm not as devout as the rest of my family, especially in regard to going to church. So is that why you don't approve of Claire and Lenny? Annie asked, because they're having premarital sex. Annie, Kate looked fearfully around the room. Shh. So that is it. Annie said triumphantly, though she lowered her voice. No. Kate sat up straighter. That's not it. So you have no problem with premarital sex, Annie said. Now you're just being argumentative, Kate said. You haven't answered the question, Annie said. She had a strange gleam in her eye. If you love someone, I think it's less of a sin than just doing it to do it, Kate said finally. And have you? Annie asked. Annie, that is, none of you, have you? Annie persisted. Yes, Kate said, I have. His name is Alex, and we dated this past spring and summer. Not that it's really any of your business. So what happened, Annie asked. Why did it end? Kate shrugged and shifted her glance from Annie's face to the remains of her soup. She waited, hoping that Annie would let it go. She, of course, didn't. We just had different ideas as to where the relationship was going, Kate said finally. That's all. So you ended it. In a manner of speaking, Kate said, but honestly, I'd really rather not discuss it. What about you? Kate asked, anxious to steer the conversation away from her. Are you seeing anyone? Do you date? I go out, Annie said, and I've had a couple of relationships, and yes, before you ask, they were sexual. I wasn't going to ask, Kate said quickly, and felt herself blush. It's okay, I'm not ashamed. I think sexual expression is a God-given right, and I think men are intimidated by that. So they call those of us who are comfortable with our sexuality whores, or they suggest that we're immoral. It's ridiculous, really. Annie's voice rose. If men can have sex without remorse, then I think we should be able to as well, without judgment, without recrimination. Annie, Kate looked around to see if anyone was listening. People can hear you. There's nothing wrong with what I'm saying, Annie continued adamantly. I'm sexual, but I'm not easy. I do what I want, and with whom, I'm the one in control. I'm the one making the decisions. Kate nodded uneasily, hoping that this was the end of the conversation. Annie sat back defiantly, almost as if she expected Kate to challenge her. Finally, Kate sighed, leaned forward, and said in a low voice, listen, it's not that I think you're not entitled to your opinion. It's just that I don't think it's appropriate to have these kinds of discussions in the break room. Okay. Annie leaned forward, mocking Kate's pose. I'll stop, but only if you answer one question. What do you think? Do women deserve the same rights as men when it comes to sex? Annie, Kate said in exasperation, I don't know. I guess. Yes, I think women deserve equal rights. I'm not sure that anyone, male or female, should be engaging in premarital sex, though, on a habitual basis. It is a sin. Funny, Annie said, her voice still low. I didn't take you for such a prude. I am not a prude, Kate exclaimed and slammed her hand down on the table. The occupants of other tables turned to stare. Annie grinned. Will you please keep your voice down? I have a reputation to think about. As you can see from the previous interaction, all three women grappled with the cultural constructs of the early 1930s in different ways. But what they didn't realize was that the long-term impact of the Great Depression was going to change the playing field yet again. As the 1930s progressed and the country struggled to right itself economically, gender, familial, and unemployment roles again changed. Jobs became more scarce, and married white women, which is what Kate ultimately becomes, were faced with strong societal pressure to give up their jobs for the men who were traditionally recognized as the breadwinners and return to the home. And to help that ensure that this happened, something happened at the federal level. Laws were passed that prohibited more than one employed person living within each household. And because men were recognized traditionally as breadwinners, they were the ones that were allowed to maintain those jobs. Meanwhile, women like Annie, who remained single, and oftentimes it was either by choice or by circumstance, these women found themselves in competition with and losing jobs to married men. This is especially true for educated women who were in professional jobs. Once again, men were the ones that were the breadwinners. But then the U.S. entered World War II, and suddenly everything changed again. Men were drafted to fight, and women who had been pushed out of the workplace were suddenly seen as this valuable resource, that they would be able to go in and do these jobs that were not just traditional jobs such as nurses and teachers and librarians, but that they were able to go in and do jobs that were considered masculine. And we've all seen the pictures of Rosie the Riveter. You know what I'm talking about when I say that. Now, according to Nancy Woolett, a women's historian at Barnard College, during World War II, the number of married white women in the workforce doubled. And for the first time, most women workers were in fact married. And interestingly enough, 1/3 of working women in 1945 had children under the age of 14 at home. So the dynamic was changing very, very quickly. Single white women too benefited from this turn of events. Suddenly, there were more jobs than there were people to fill them. And with fewer men, women had tremendous freedom and opportunity. As a result, divorce rates rose. And again, you see women asserting their independence until the war ended. And when the war ended, the men came home. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to rush through this next bit, but given that it's about the baby boomers, it might be a little bit more familiar. After the war ended, the soldiers returned home, and not only did they want their jobs back, they also wanted the American dream. They wanted a wife, they wanted kids, and they wanted homes in the suburbs. They wanted the perfect life. And the post-war era of the 1940s and early 50s saw an increase in marriage and a baby boom that exceeded anything that's ever been seen before or since. Married white women moved back into the home, and across the United States there was a shift in the social consciousness regarding women who worked. Suddenly, the inclination and the cultural mindset was that women should be at home. The ideal housewife supported her husband while she managed the household and cared for children. Now, in regard to letters never sent, this plays out in that Kate, who has married a man she doesn't love, becomes pregnant with Joan after he comes home from the war. And again, she never really wanted to be married. She never really wanted to have children, but she finds herself in this situation. And it was part of the social construct of the time. She did it, but she didn't do it very happily, as evidenced by the scene, and this is the last one that I'll read, where Joan rushes in, very excited about the fact that neighbors have moved into the house next door. "Mama," Joan called. Catherine heard the screen door bang shut. Scowling, she hurried from the kitchen. Joan skidded to a halt in the hall. "Mama, guess what? Guess what? Joni, how many times have I told you not to run in the house and not to let the screen door slam?" "I'm sorry." Joan dropped her chin to her chest. Kate sighed and tried to remind herself that Joan was just a little girl with lots of energy. It wasn't her fault that Kate was tired and developing one of her headaches. She forced a less severe expression onto her face. "So, what was so urgent that you had to run in here like a wild Indian to tell me?" "Oh, Mama," Joan said, suddenly excited again, "there are men moving things into the house next door. I saw them, and I saw the woman again, and the little boy." Catherine craned her neck to peer out the front door. There was indeed a moving van. "Did you talk to her or her husband?" Joan shook her head. "You told me not to." Catherine blinked and looked at her daughter in surprise. "Good girl." She patted Joan on the shoulder. Joan beamed at the attention. "Can I go watch them? I'll stay out of the way, I promise." "It's lunchtime," Catherine said. "Maybe after you eat." "But I want to play with Jason," Joan said. "Please?" "Joan." Catherine felt herself quickly losing her patience. "Go wash your hands for lunch." In an expression that almost mirrored Catherine's, Joan narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms. Despite irritation, Catherine almost smiled. She studied her daughter for several seconds and then softened. "What if I read to you this afternoon? We could read a Nancy Drew mystery." Joan shrugged noncommittally. "Either way," Catherine said, "you need to eat your lunch." She pointed into the kitchen. "Ham sandwich and a pickle, and be careful about the crumbs I just swept." Joan disappeared into the kitchen, and Catherine stepped to the screen and looked at the movers. The same slender woman she'd seen before stood on the porch of the house next door. She still wore sunglasses, but this time, her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She watched the woman until Joan hurried back into the kitchen, climbed into her chair, and began to babble on and on about the furniture, the woman, and her son. Joan shoved the last bite of pickle into her mouth, and while still chewing, stood up and said, "Can I go outside now?" Catherine was inwardly amused at her daughter's persistence, though she tried not to show it. "Yes, but stay on the porch or in the backyard, and do not bother the new neighbors or the movers." She pointed a finger at Joan in warning. "I mean it." Joan nodded, pushed her chair in, and walked sedately out of the kitchen until she was out of earshot. Kate could hear her running down the hall and out onto the porch. The screen door banged shut. Catherine flinched and pressed her fingertips to her temples. Noises were too sharp today, always an indicator of one of her headaches. At this rate, she knew that she would be locked in her room with a cool rag over her forehead by nighttime. Clyde would have to cook dinner for Joni. The thought of her husband made her frown. In the years since Joan's birth, Catherine had spoken to him only the words necessary to run the household. Their dislike for each other bound them together just as surely as she needed his financial support and he needed someone to take care of his daughter. Even when they moved into Lawrence from the country, they spoke only enough to arrange the move. Dinners were spent in a cool silence until Joan was old enough to speak, and then she carried the conversation for both of them. The reason why I mention this, and the reason why I chose that particular reading, is because we've reached a point in which Kate has accepted her lot in life. She has bowed to the gender roles of the time. She's living back in Kansas. She has married a local boy, a farmer, and she is a mother. She's everything that her family wanted her to be, and she's miserable. Like many women at the time, she did ultimately what was expected of her, and surprisingly, so did her daughter many years later. Even though Joan was a baby boomer and grew up in a very, very different era, an era where women's rights were front and center, she ultimately made a lot of the same choices that her mother did, and she experienced many of the same regrets. This, of course, begs the question of, was it because there was still that expectation of marriage, a home, a family, even though it wasn't as pronounced? Was it because there was still a subtle pressure on women to adhere to the traditional gender roles? I think that for the characters in Letters Never Sent, the argument could be made that yes, there was. But more to the point, I think that the argument could also be made that there still is. Having said that, thank you very much for coming and taking the time to listen to what I have to say, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Those of you who haven't read it now, you want to, I'm sure. And we do have 10 minutes for questions if anyone has some that they would like to ask. I was interested in the 20s because my grandmother was a widow in the 20s and of course had been at home raising 3 children. And her husband died on the Santa Fe Railroad. And so she was given a job at the Santa Fe offices and there were no married women. She was the only married woman until the war, because they did not allow women to be married and work at the Santa Fe. So I could identify with that very strongly. Yes?
I'm just curious, I'm one of those faces you didn't know, so I don't know your background, what made you write this full story?
Well, my background is actually very varied. I've worked in politics, I've worked as a journalist, and now as an anthropology professor, but I've always been really interested in gender roles, and I teach a section of my class dealing with that. And I have to admit, I love historical fiction. And there's something, I know I didn't live through, you know, the World War II, but there's, because I'm sure it wouldn't have been romantic. But there's something that I find very romantic about that era, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I read a lot of books about that. And it just is such a rich period of time to look at all of the changes and how it's brought us to where we are today.
Did you base any personal relatives or any of your characters on your relatives?
I didn't. There are a couple of names that I borrowed of relatives and friends, but other than that, no. They're really, you know, a combination of different people that I've read about and just general experiences of the time. Good question. Others?
I have a question. I didn't know that there was a law that said that there could only be one worker in a household. When was that and how was that?
It was a law that was passed just prior to World War II, and it was because there were a lot of married women that had previously had the freedoms to be in the workforce, and then during the Great Depression, when there were so few jobs, they really wanted to save those jobs for the men. And so they, you know, passed a law that said, only one per household, and that usually meant that the man got the job.
That's terrible.
How long did it last? How long did that law stay on the books?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. actually the third novel that I wrote, but it's the first one that's been published. And I had, as I said, I'd always had this fascination with this time period, and I do a lot of running, as you know, and I create a lot of stories and work through a lot of issues, personal and also, people that don't exist while I'm running. And so I tend to create the stories while I'm doing that. But I have a pretty solid writing pattern where I get up and I have a massive amount of coffee. And then I go downstairs and I write for a few hours before I have to go to school. And so I dedicate that time, and I actually have a couple of songs that I play that, get me in the game, get my head in the game. So
how long did it take you to write?
it took me about 4 months. Now, keep in mind, once I wrote it, I sent it out to people who read it, and beta readers, and offered their suggestions. And in fact, I'll share with you, one of the things that was in the first draft that did not make it into the one that has been published was that I had Joan, who is pregnant with her boss's child, I had her drinking a lot, even though she knew she was pregnant. And several of the people that read it initially said, that's upsetting, and a pregnant woman, A, doesn't really want alcohol, and 3, or C, depending on if I was doing numbers or letters, a woman would not do that. And not being a mother, I didn't know that. So that was one of the major changes that I made. So it went out to beta readers, they sent their comments, and then I did rewrites.
So you tend to now take those other 2 novels and try and
Yes.
Yeah.
It's, actually I'm working on a 4th novel right now that probably is the one that's going to go next, because it's much more in line with letters. The first one is set in a town very much like Dover. And then the second one is about an advertising executive who's commissioned by God to write a New Testament to the Bible and then market it. And they're markedly different than the voice in letters, so we're thinking that the one I'm working on now, creatively titled Untitled Manuscript number 4. Yeah.
Do you still notice a lot of gender bias in everyday interactions with people? I hear and see things all the time that just make me go, really?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, a neighbor commented to me after he saw me mowing one time and complimented that I did the turnarounds correctly.
Good for you. Well done. Did John teach you how to do that?
He always has input. I just, little things like that, or I have to go home and cook dinner, or...
I do. Now keep in mind I teach undergraduates, so I've seen a tremendous amount of change in terms of gender roles and gender bias in the classroom, but at the same time, quite honestly, not that much. One of the things I talk about, which is reflected in the book, is in anthropology there's this thing called double workload. And double workload is where you have women that are employed full-time outside of the house. And then even though they work the same amount of hours doing, the same caliber of work, the expectation is that they come home, that they do the laundry, that they cook for the kids, that they have dinner on the table, that they show the kids around. And that's not to say that the men don't help out with that, but the expectation is that the women are the ones that are going to do that. And whenever I talk about it in class, I always have the women in the class like, they are. So yes, I do still see that. Yeah.
Sandy, I want to read your book. I haven't, but I will. Interested in knowing how does the role of American women compare to what you would find in countries, Western Europe, civilization?
Not surprisingly, you see a lot of similarities between what was going on with American women at this time. And you see some similarities in English-speaking European, and also to a certain extent in like France and places like that. But what I find even more interesting is that, and I made a point to distinguish this when I was speaking, white women had a very, very different experience during these time periods than African American women. I mean, very, very different. And so, again, I mean, there's so many issues that play into this, but color is one of them. But for example, in the UK, you see you know, the suffrage movement there as well, and you see women really rallying to the battle cry.
Yes. I have a question regarding the setting. Obviously, there's familiarity in Kansas, and you mentioned the fourth novel that is set in Kansas again. Is that, I mean, you drew upon things that you'd seen for characters, but nobody direct. But what drew you to Kansas, other than obvious that it's familiar, but why this setting?
Well, Letters is actually set. Letters is set in Kansas, yes, but it's also set in Chicago. And I grew up in Dover, a town of 200 on a good day. Yeah. And so I understood small town, but for like the bits about Chicago, I actually went to Chicago and walked the route that Kate and Annie and Claire would take. I went to the museums. They have a World's Fair Museum. Looked at the exhibits. I went to the library where they spend a certain amount of time and talked to the docents and walked around and saw where they would sit. I found the buildings where they would live and took pictures. I chose their windows. I knew what rooms they lived in. It was a little strange because they felt really like real people. And so I spent a fair amount of time really researching. I mean, I understood a lot about Kansas, but I spent a lot of time researching in Chicago as well. And for anyone who's interested, on my author Facebook page, I actually have a photo album that has all of these pictures on there if you're interested, like the Tiffany Dome of the library and their buildings and all of that. Did that answer your question?
Okay. Well, we do have to stop because Sandra is going to the White Book Den, where she will have copies of her books and you will be able to get a signed copy. So I hope you'll come visit us there. And thank you so much for coming.